Well, hi there, everyone. 5 p.m. Sydney time, 4 p.m. up here in Queensland. And thank you for every one of you joining us right across every single platform. And what I need you to do is right now, guys, get on your social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, all of them, and say, hey, we have an exclusive here with two of what I believe to be the most brilliant minds in our nation, if not the world, really sharing with us what's going on and the hidden agenda and the new world order. And this is going to be a powerful, powerful afternoon. And I know many of you are excited about that. Before I introduce our special guest, let me just interestingly say that today the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Victoria has issued a statement on behalf of the Victorian courts and the VCAT to indicate that judicial officers and court and tribunal staff are not subject to the authorised workers' vaccination mandates under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act. Well, this raises a couple of questions as to why other workers in Victoria, including pastors and leaders and Christian leaders, have to be subject to these, and why are these people exempt when everyone else's livelihoods? Now, I know our two VIP guests are going to actually blow you away with some real insight into this. First VIP guest is a great friend of mine. I love how he writes. He's satirical, but he's actually so truthful in what he says. My great friend, James McPherson from Spectator magazine. How are you, James?
Hey, Pat, I'm very well. Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you, man. You're looking so sharp there with the Gucci stubble beard. Is that the COVID look or the fashionista look?
Yeah, it's the lockdown look, Pat. It's the lockdown look.
Well, I know one thing, James. They might be out, they locked you out, but they cannot lock down that pen of yours, which you write so brilliantly. And of course, I came to know Alexandra Marshall through James McPherson. And James is going to help me interview this brilliant lady, brilliant journalist, Spectator magazine, Sky News. I said while we were preparing, she is the rose in between the two thorns. James had issue with that. But ladies, can we all welcome Alexandra Marshall to today's pre and pushback preview? Hey, how are you, Alexandra?
I am here and ready to cause trouble.
Now, Alexandra, let me ask you, do you prefer to be called Alexandra or Ellie?
I honestly don't mind whichever one you remember as you're speaking. Normally I get both.
All right. Well, we might just, mix it up a little bit. Ellie, you wrote this article, which absolutely blew me away. And I want to ask you a question. What in the heck has happened to our country since this under covert operations of a virus? It seems like imprisonments, hurts, fines, arrests, families falling apart. What in the world has happened to our country?
Well, sadly, it is textbook propaganda. Literally, propaganda 101 is what Australia fell for. All this time, the elites of the world have been looking for an excuse, the perfect apocalypse, to bring about their, quote unquote, new world order. And they tried for a long time with climate change, but of course the climate change apocalypse was too obscure and it kept refusing to manifest over the decades. And so they never quite got there with climate change. But with COVID, it originated in the heart of the West's geopolitical adversary, which is China. And it genuinely does kill people. And so it was easy enough for them to transform what should have been a relatively moderate virus as far as history goes and the world goes, and transform it into this massive global event that has been resetting our political norms and dragging us toward a tyrannical future that nobody in Australia wants, at least not when they see what it really looks like.
James?
Well, that raises the question, Ali, that, they tried to use climate as a way to implement global policies. That wasn't working. So suddenly COVID comes along. So here's the question. Was that just good fortune? Did they just make the best of a bad situation? Or do you believe in something a little more sinister with regards to COVID suddenly making an appearance?
Well, the most important thing to remember is that the climate change apocalypse has not gone away. They are going to bring that one back once they've got all their systems in place, because what they need to do is reacquire land. And to do that, they actually have to implement the climate change policies. They can't use COVID for that kind of thing. So keep an eye on that. That's coming back. As far as whether COVID was just an opportunity, don't forget the people that run things like the World Economic Forum say things like, don't let a good apocalypse go to waste. And for the last 5 or so years, these people have been orchestrating or at least organizing themselves in preparation for an opportunity just like COVID. So to prove that point and to highlight that this is not just random conspiracy, but actually factual information, I did write down a few of the names that people can go and look at themselves. So in 2017, at the Davos Convention, which is run by the World Economic Forum, they launched the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which was based off a joint project by the World Health Organization and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, what this was the idea that vaccines couldn't compete in a capitalist market. They couldn't rely on the market forces to properly build vaccines. So instead, what they did was convince a coalition of companies and nations to pour money in to this new project in preparation for a disease X scenario. Now, what that involved was pushing mRNA vaccines to market without any actual underlying force. And to justify it, they started to run these pandemic preparedness scenarios with all of our world leaders and a lot of our big tech companies. And they called these things like the Clade exercise in 2018 and the Event 201 in 2019, which ironically ended just before the onset of COVID. So our world leaders are already looking, going, oh no, the world's going to end in some pandemic event. And so when COVID came along, they were so used to this idea, it was easy enough to just nudge them over the cliff and say, yep, this is an apocalypse, when it really wasn't.
Alexandra, there's something that just irks me and has irked me for months. Notice I'm an Italian, son of immigrant parents, born in this country, got my Australian flag out there, going to get my Australian flag in my boat, got one out on the pole there. But what I don't understand, what the hell happened to Scott Morrison at G7? We had one death over an 8-month period. ScoMo comes back, gets together the underbosses, as I call them, I'm an ex-street guy, and all hell lets loose on our country. It's like, and I say this, I know my wife tells me off for using this name, it's like we were vomited on with an agenda. We had a country reasonably intact before the G7. Could you help me understand that? Because my street smarts goes, nah, I'm not buying what you're selling, Scotty.
It didn't happen to Scott Morrison at the G7. I have been watching Scott Morrison like a hawk since he first stepped in front of Turnbull at the podium to take power, because of course he wasn't a conservative, he was one of the moderates. He tried for Turnbull's position back when they were trying to roll Abbott. He was part of that whole group, and he was no innocent in any of this. And his personal politics, long before the pandemic, even before the bushfire scenario, he was cuddling up to Jacinda Ardern and the European Union's copyright legislation to do things like censor the internet. He was a big state lovey who wants to have more and more control over the Australian population. And worse, he has no natural empathy, which is why he had to hire an empathy coach for the bushfires. So he has this mixture of being a weak leader, having no political historical knowledge, so he doesn't understand the damage that he is doing in his quest for power. And he is easily led astray by those other world leaders around him. You can say things like, oh, it's for your own good. And Morrison will be like, yeah, I could probably sell that line. And so all the G7 did was consolidate Scott Morrison's belief that today was the day he could push what he'd been wanting to push for some time. I mean, his team went back through social media and removed the occasions in which he said Build Back Better once it became politically unwelcome for him to have that language out there when all that trouble was going on with Boris Johnson. So he's already been saying the right things as far as the the global alliance has been going. He's just tried to maintain his popularity and his veneer of being conservative, when in reality he never was.
Before I get James asked, I've been wanting to ask this question, and I'm just trying to get the guts to ask it. Here it is. Shouldn't our politicians, moral, as you stated in your article so brilliantly, their moral values, their spiritual beliefs, and again, it's not their spiritual, shouldn't their moral values and their first call of duty be to protect the Australian people and our freedoms that are given to us? When did these guys learn to be, well, crooked than a stick that I pick up in my garden? Or do they not have a sense of north? I'm asking you this because you're a very learned lady, and I look at it from a street perspective and from a spiritual perspective. But can you talk to me about what happened to the morals of our political leaders?
Well, they've always been, forgive me, but shits in politics. That is known since the dawn of time, as far back as you can run it. But the difference was, particularly in the English Westminster system of politics, at least half of the politicians were drawn from the public, from people who had businesses and who had life experiences, even people who were at the very least generals and knew what a battlefield looked like. Because let's not forget, the natural end of politics is war. And if you don't understand that, then you don't understand politics or what you're actually playing with in society. Now, what we have in Australia are generations and generations of inbred politicians. They are literally the political offspring of other failed politicians. And now we're so far down the barrel, we've got basically staffers who are elevated to politicians who've lived in the public service all their life, have no idea what the world looks like or what the mechanisms are which hold society together. And so they don't know what it is they're actually trying to manage, which is their job. They're servants, public servants. And worse, people's classical knowledge of history, and particularly the history of their own nation, used to be much stronger. So even the ordinary citizen off the street knew more about their history and more about the philosophy of their civilization than the average person does today. And so they're weak, they have no understanding of what they're actually in, and worse still, they don't know what the consequence of failure really is.
James?
Ellie, just while we're on Scott, one of my questions about Scott Morrison relates to the formation of the National Cabinet. And I can't work out whether Scott Morrison's decision to form a National Cabinet of state premiers to attack COVID was a good faith move where he genuinely thought, let's have national unity in order to address this pandemic, and it just kind of got away from him. Or was it a political move whereby he could sheet all responsibility for anything that goes wrong to the premiers? Regardless of what motivated him, he's now in a position where, sorry, that's my son ringing the doorbell, I'll get to him in a second. Morrison is now in a position where, as Prime Minister, he seems to have lost control of the country. State premiers are running the place. Do you think that was always his intention, or was the formation of the National Cabinet a good faith move that kind of got away from him?
Well, we know the answer for sure in his behaviour since it was created. The idea that it was a good faith move was entirely trashed in its concept when he was asked to reveal what was happening in National Cabinet. And instead of listening to the federal court, he has made moves to change the law entirely to keep the secrets of National Cabinet. So whatever it is, it's not a good faith move. But at the outset, I pointed out that anything to do with quarantine or a viral outbreak comes under the legal portfolio of the Prime Minister. It is a federal issue, and it always has been. First under the Quarantine Act of 1908, and then under the Biosecurity Act, which replaced it. They're essentially the same act with a couple of minor changes. And I said that at the time, and all the other press around me said, what are you talking about? Health is a state issue. But of course, when it comes to pandemics, health is not a state issue, it's a federal issue. And still to this day, the National Cabinet or no National Cabinet, Scott Morrison can click his fingers and change what the premiers are doing. He can override anything in the state to do with quarantine or these health measures. He could end the emergency legislation today if he wanted to. What he didn't want to do was take responsibility for the failure of health measures. Now, all of our politicians, not just ours, but across the world, made a huge mistake when they decided to take personal responsibility for COVID. It wasn't their fault. It was China's fault, which, if you remember, Trump quite rightly always referred to it as the China flu. Because once a virus is outside, no politician can control what's going to happen with it. It's like standing on the shore and trying to stop the tide. You can't. So making themselves politically responsible means that they now view failure as with the virus as them losing their power and their regime. So Scott Morrison didn't want to have that attached to his campaign for COVID. So what he did instead was he created national cabinet so that he could give all the premiers, which don't forget are mostly Labor premiers, which he knew he'd get pushback if he gave them directions, power to make their own mistakes. So instead of standing up as leader and doing the best thing for Australian citizens and upholding the liberties and essential values of Australians, he let this racket of premiers compete in their ever-increasing arms race for lockdowns and mandates, and he never stopped them because he figures if they succeed, he can take the praise for that. He can say, well, I ran National Cabinet, therefore I'm responsible for saving Australia. And if they fail, he can say, well, look, it wasn't me, it was the state premiers. They're all responsible for their own states. So as a marketer, which is what he is at heart, that was a strategic decision that he made. And it shows that he is not a leader. He is not a prime minister, because no prime minister would allow their citizens to be abused like the premiers have abused them.
Alexandra, Ellie, you are my favorite person right now outside of my wife and my daughters. I am so sick and tired of this sacred cow of a prime minister. Firstly, and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to get in trouble, hiding behind his Christian banner. I just want to, honestly, and I want to slap that smirk off his face because I can see it. And, I wasn't raised, my mum used to say, be careful of the man. It's a Chinese proverb, little did I realise till later. Be careful of the man that smiles at you and laughs at you and his belly's not moving. But I want to ask this question, which is another pertinent question. We hear a lot of people say, and a lot online, the emergency powers. They're running out of emergency powers. They're going to take us in a lockdown. What were these emergency powers? What do they represent? And are they anyway reflective of the socialist dictatorships that we are being incarcerated with at the moment? Can you explain to me, because there's a lot of confusion out there, and again, every as I call them now, we used to have the village idiots, now the buggers have gone global on social media. Everyone's got an interpretation of that. Can you tell us what they mean, what they really mean, and what really is the power and extension of those powers that premiers and our unelected health officials have?
To understand emergency powers, you first have to realize what makes a dictatorship and versus what makes a democracy. Now, dictatorships at the behest of one leader can make decisions really quickly and force a country to adhere to them. That's what it means to be a totalitarian nation. Now, the strength of a democracy is that we make lots of decisions all the time. We follow them, they get rolled back, we have elections, we chop and change so often that, like the general evolutionary period of organisms, we eventually move toward the best possible solution because we try lots of things all the time. But that takes time. That makes democracies move more slowly than dictatorships. And I explained it in one article. It's like Xi Jinping, who runs the communist China, is like a guy in a sports car driving at 200 miles around the Amalfi Coast. Eventually, he's going to hit a curve and go off the cliff. Well, democracies avoid that problem of collapse by the way that we run our election cycles and move steadily. Unfortunately, every now and then, there is an existential crisis which requires a civilization to move quickly or it will collapse. And we call that more, historically speaking, the war economy, which most people will understand that concept where in a war, different rules apply and we're able to make decisions more quickly. Now, what emergency legislation is like a short war economy style thing that allows a premier or a prime minister in Australia to put a 2-week suspension on all of our normal laws so that they can make decisions quickly that are required without going through the parliamentary process, which is too slow to cope with them. And it was designed, quite rightly, to deal with things like, oh my God, there's a comet heading towards Sydney right now. We need to make decisions immediately to save people, or a flood or a fire front. Things like that are required for emergency legislation. Now, they only last 2 weeks, but there is a caveat where you can extend emergency legislation after the first one finishes. Now, this was meant in case your emergency just managed to creep over the 2-week period. What it wasn't meant to do was provide a parallel, indefinite system of laws in Australia extending for more than 2 years. That was not the intention of emergency legislation when it was written. So our premiers and our prime minister are purposefully misusing a good piece of legislation that's required for their own purposes because they don't want to solve the problem within the normal bounds of our liberties and laws.
Oh.
Ellie, that raises a great point, because just to move from COVID back to climate for a second, we often hear added banter talking about climate emergency. We have in the UK pressure for the British Parliament to declare a climate emergency. Extinction Rebellion are always talking about the fact we've got a climate emergency. So listening to your last answer about how emergency powers can be used to override normal democratic processes, when the environmental movement talk about a climate emergency, it's more than just rhetoric. There's actually a maneuver they're attempting to make here to put governments in a position where they now have the ability to override democratic norms. Would that be a fair understanding?
In one of my articles in The Spectator called Digital Darkness, I make the point that speaking about climate change and COVID as a war is a conflict against good and evil, and we're all in this together to fight this. That is a deliberate rhetoric to remind people of accepted war economy style legislation, to take them out of the frame set of their normal lives and put them into this idea that they're living in a catastrophe and that the abuses against them are justified because they're fighting an existential threat. Now, the difference is, in a war economy, that's true. There are missiles coming towards you and there really is a crisis. But right now, the only crisis is the rhetoric that they manage to put out in propaganda to make people believe that there's a problem. But were you not permanently subjected to this rhetoric, then you wouldn't know. And it's a sleight of hand, which is as aided and abetted by the media, I have to say.
Interview that he did with you, he said if it wasn't for the news media, we wouldn't know there's a pandemic out there. Well, I actually don't think it's a pandemic out there. And sadly, the news media has so indoctrinated people, and then it goes and vilifies everybody with a different stand. People like RV Emily or Rebel News or Rukshan or anyone with a different narrative gets slammed as either a conspiracy theorist. I mean, I've been called a conspiracy theorist, and I said, hang on, if I'd have said to you 18 months ago that we'd still be here after a 2-week curfew, you'd have called me conspiracy theorist. If I'd have said to you, you would have to show identification whether you got done the right thing by the government or not to go in and out of a restaurant, you'd have called me a conspiracy theorist. In relation to that, the New World Order, can you talk to us about this? And do you believe there is a strategic move to a reset? And I'm going to ask, and there's a 3-part question. Do you see the day when there will be one global leader?
Okay, you might have to remind me of your 3-part question as we go
All
on.
right,
With this
I'll
answer.
get James to help me because
first,
James has got a great memory, and he's looking at me saying, "You're stealing my questions."
Okay. The first part is New World Order is a phrase that has been around for a long time and gets continuously reused. And if you go to the Wikipedia page, there are 2 pages for New World Order, one labeled as conspiracy and one labeled as historical fact. But funnily enough, they both describe exactly the same thing, which is a globalist totalitarian order run by unelected officials. Now, sometimes the World Economic Forum writes articles talking about the New World Order as the rise of Asia and moving America from being the policeman of the world to China. Yeah, heaven forbid that happen. But what it most commonly refers to is the New World Order of our digital surveillance, or our transition to digital surveillance. And so people think it's actually about this COVID thing and COVID rules, but it's more about turning people into digital products and to monitor and track us in some ungodly, unholy new social credit system. But the reason they want to do that, which is often missed, is because this idea of a new world order is not new. It was the dream of every international socialist the last century, to be rulers of the world in this unelected little bureaucracy that they wanted to have going. That's what the New World Order was to them. Same thing, different century, they just changed the name. But of course, you can't rule over sovereign nations as an unelected bureaucracy any more strongly than the UN. The UN's about as close as they've been able to get to it without becoming overt. So what they do instead is they need to have a way to turn nations into vassal states of this unelected bureaucracy. And to do that, the first thing they have to do is know what everyone's doing and what everyone's thinking. And they do that by implementing exactly what China did, which is a totalitarian style, complete surveillance that no civilization in history has ever had. No matter how tyrannical our old world leaders were in history, they never had the same amount of power and knowledge over their citizens as we see today, which is really frightening when you think about it. And the point of that is, how do I explain this properly? People like Alexander the Great wanted to rule the world, right? It's not a new concept, but they learned pretty quickly that as you expanded your empire, you started to lose control, because human beings like to fracture off and create little diverse groups and change. And it's because we're tribal. It's our very nature to become independent and unique as our geography expresses out. We're almost completely averse to being underneath a global rule. So in order to expand territory and keep people from diverging and segregating off into their own civilizations, you have to control them and exert more and more control. And that's through primarily brainwashing children, which is what China does, and then making sure that those who start to dissent, which is a natural ramification of this, are punished immediately. Even down to your food choices, you get punished in China. So it's about holding the state of the New World Order once it's created. Otherwise, it will just fracture and fall apart immediately. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, hang on. Yeah, it has. But I'm going to bring James. I want to ask James a couple of questions in a second. But do you believe? Now, the Christian movement believes in Book of Revelation there's one guy that gets elected, or not elected, but he comes in and takes over, and without his permission, and you can't buy, sell, do anything. Do you believe there is a move towards a global leader?
It's not going to be one leader. It will be a panel of leaders. This kind of socialist bureaucracy always has. I mean, globalism is basically world socialism, just to be clear. And there will never be one leader. There'll be a little group of people who elect themselves leaders, and it'll be a combination between bureaucrats and the company heads of these massive organizations, and a few political members of probably the most powerful countries. And yes, in every iteration of humanity, there's always people with too much money and power trying to rule the world. It's a common thread to humanity. So yes, even our century, the exact same thing's happening. And I'll tell you what, Klaus Schwab doesn't help by dressing up in robes and looking like a little Bond villain off the sides. But could you be less obvious in what you're trying to do, please? It's almost theatrical to the point of absurdity.
Do you know, I want to say this to everyone, and again, please, Alexandra, James, correct me if I'm wrong. No nation has ever lost their freedoms and had any despot or dictator give them back the very freedoms they had. That's why I believe we need to fight for our freedoms. And I'm going to ask both of you if you could help me with this question. The great Francis Schaeffer wrote a book called What Then Shall We Do Now? My question to you both is, from a both perspective, and James, if you could help me from a Christian perspective, as being a great journalist and a great man that knows a lot of the Bible, but also Alexander, if you could help us, what could we do as citizens? So, James, what shall we do now?
Well, there's the $1 million question, isn't it? Look, I think as Christians, we live in two kingdoms. So we are part of the kingdom of God, but we also live in Australia, and we have responsibilities in both of those sectors. And I think the mistake that some Christians make is they say, no, we're just Christians and part of the kingdom of God, and so therefore we are going to abdicate completely any responsibility or civic duty in terms of the way the nation goes. That's a mistake. On the other hand, some Christians get so involved in politics, they forget we are strangers in a strange land, according to the scriptures. And so we do have other priorities, eternal priorities. So it's not one or the other. We've got to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time, and to help to build a nation for our children and our children's children, while at the same time remembering that politics is important, but it's not the most important thing. So I think there's that balance for Christian people.
Yeah. Where I, and again, James, you and I've talked over, and thank you for keeping me calm and sane. You've been, Ellie, he's been a real godsend for me. What irritates me, and again, I say this with a soft heart, is when I hear people say, "Oh, we just got to obey the government because of one scripture in Romans." Well, firstly, the guy that wrote that was in prison because he disobeyed the government. But when I look at, Moses disobeyed Pharaoh, Dietrich Bonhoeffer disobeyed Hitler, William Tyndale disobeyed the leadership of the day, and that's why we have this sacred book here. They dug him up, and they were so mad they dug him up and burned him again. When I look at Gandhi, great spiritual, when I look at Martin Luther King, the great civil rights leader, stood against those things, and they were vocal. And Rahab, I mean, I could go on and on and on and on. And what concerns me is that, I believe, number one, America needs to be strong for the world to be safe. I believe that. And that's why I so appreciated what you said there, Ellie, before. We abdicate to China, we're all some. But I also believe that the church needs to be strong and compassionate and be involved in politics. Telling me that we should not be involved in political issues. Well, let me say this, BLM, who is at the forefront of that? It's easy to be brave from a distance for something that's happening to a guy in America, but what about here? And that really bothers me. Loss of jobs, medical apartheid, medical discrimination, suicide. I know, and I got to keep, I burst into tears every time I think of this. I know of one place in New South Wales, 7 suicides, and not one policeman has been sent there to put a barricade around that place. 7. And this is happening, and our churches are silent. You said something really interesting in an article, and it was quoted by our good friend Daniel Hagen. And this is what you said. You said, pastors who create a false choice by saying we must focus on preaching the gospel rather than advocating for freedom of religion are the same pastors who rightly would not hesitate to fight local councils if regulations prohibit them from expanding their auditoriums. I wish I'd have said that. Talk to us about that.
Look, I think for Christians, we need to understand that there are 3 key institutions that as Christians we would believe that God created. God created the family, he created the government, and he created the church. And those are 3 of God's greatest ideas, and he created each institution to fulfill specific roles. So God created the family for the propagation of life. He created the government for the protection of citizens, and he created the church for the proclamation of the gospel. Now, a functioning society is one where you've got strong families, you've got a competent government, and you've got vibrant church. A dysfunctional society occurs when one or more of those institutions starts to break down, either through family breakdown, government corruption and incompetence, or through a lukewarm church. But the other chaotic effect happens when one of those institutions starts to go beyond the bounds for which God created it. For instance, we talk about the nanny state, and that's a term of derision used to describe what happens when the government start to do what families should do. For instance, when the local school says they're going to start teaching gender fluidity to students, parents get rightly concerned, because we know instinctively it's the role of a mum and dad to talk to their kids about sexuality, not some stranger paid by the state. We also understand that if a church goes beyond teaching family principles and starts to get involved in family life, that church ceases to be a church and becomes a cult. So each of those institutions has a role to play, and society functions well when those institutions stay doing what God created to do. We're in a situation in Australia where the government is now encroaching on what families are supposed to do. It's deciding who can visit your home, how many people can attend a funeral, whether or not you're allowed to visit your aging parent. The government is also encroaching on church, now trying to determine who can and can't attend a worship service based upon their medical history. So the church has been rightly reluctant to speak out. Now, I need to say this, Pat. Christians need to be involved in politics. The church rightly stays out of politics. And we've seen what happens when the church gets involved in politics. There are a litany of popes who were more interested in commanding armies than preaching the gospel, and everyone, the church, all society, suffered. But when the government starts to exceed its limits of authority and it starts to do what families are supposed to do, and indeed it starts to do what the church was intended to do, then there comes a time when the church needs to speak up and needs to speak up for freedom. And I understand why many pastors have been reluctant to this point, because we understand separation of church and state. We don't want to get it wrong, but there comes a time when it's so apparent that the government is now deliberately, willfully, and continually overstepping the bounds for which it was created, that men of God and churches need to speak up. Otherwise, we start to lose our freedom, not only to practice our faith, but to preach our faith. And I believe we've come to that time in Australia.
Brilliant. I just had a thought, Ellie and James, if I could get you both on camera. I've just decided where I want to spend my next 2-week vacation. Inside both of your minds. That's where I want to spend. Ellie, I want to ask you the same question, but can you help us? People are confused, and I know they write to you, and they want to do something. They don't know what to do. We don't have guns. Our guns were taken off us, and I'm not encouraging people to go and get guns. That's not me. That same question, what shall we then do? What can we do? We're waiting for a federal election, and I think Morrison's in big trouble, to be honest with you. The worst thing about it is Albanese is going from the frying pan into a fiery furnace, and I think the minor parties are going to give them a big shock. But what can we do about mandates? What can we do about these so-called, losses, these losses of freedom? What can we do on a practical, governmental, local, state, federal level?
Well, the first thing to know is to understand why this New World Order stuff works and why it works on our politicians. And the most common thing that you see in print about why someone like Scott Morrison is placating these globalist alliances is because they want to look good and noble and honorable in the eyes of the global elite. They literally want a little like from the global tyranny. So it's more about approval and fitting in with this mob, because they've started to equate it with being a just and good human being if you comply with the world order. That's where we're at right now. Now, that's a very fragile kind of idea for a politician to have, because while it's great to be praised, what they really fear, any politician fears, is when the people start to say no and start to offer up robust, shall we say, criticism of politicians. Because at the end of the day, no matter how great a politician thinks they are all held together by the power of their electorate. And if they lose the confidence and the majority of the electorate, they're consigned to the dustbin. They're gone. Like it or not, that's how politics works. And so if you want to start to change the opinion of people like Scott Morrison, you don't do it by trying to dismantle the global bureaucracies. Because, and here's a little secret, they actually have no power. no power. They're like those contracts that used to be signed, the treaties between France and England back in the Middle Ages, where the kings would just tear them up when they want to. That's the power of a global bureaucracy. It's nothing if nobody enforces it. And so what you have to focus on is your leader, and make it known to them that they will lose all of their power on both sides of the political field if they continue to sell Australia out to these international socialists. And
is there any templates on what people can write to that? Because people go, okay, I write. What do I write? Who do I write to? You know.
No, I was going to tell you how to do it. So we are really lucky. A lot of our political system has been trashed. Don't get me wrong. But the Westminster system was created by very smart people. And the role of minor parties, which are still there, is to disrupt totalitarian rule. So people say, oh, if you vote for minor parties, you're going to stop Parliament, and you're going to, legislation is going to get stuck. And that's the point. That's why they exist, to put a brake on what's being rushed through. And when you vote minor parties in, two things happen. Either one of your major parties is forced to disassemble itself and rebuild itself better than it was. Not build back better, I'm talking about actually evolve into what it should be. Or you end up with both parties redefining themselves back across the line where they should be. And so you have to use minor parties to the full extent of their purpose in the Westminster system to stop this basically mono party of Labor and Liberal that we have developed in our country, in almost every state of our country. So my advice would be, if you want to stop this, you have to freak out all of your major parties by voting for any minor party, preferably a Conservative party, but you've got to rob the major parties of their power base. That takes away their money, and it takes away a lot of their privileges and a lot of their ability to keep doing what they're doing to you. So start there. And also talk on social media. They're very vain politicians. They're known for their vanity. If you start bombarding the internet with the opposing thought, then they'll stop seeing your silence as consensus, which is how it works.
Well, I want to say something to all our listeners here today. Look, during the Second World War, Roosevelt had a problem. He got elected, but what had happened was he'd upset Kaiser, he upset Boeing, he upset Henry Ford, he upset all these factory-owning tyrants and got elected. But what happened was Pearl Harbor dragged the Americans in. And so Roosevelt had a problem. He had the Japanese in the East and he had the Nazis on the West. But also he had this problem with the big people like Boeing and Kaiser and DuPont and Henry Ford. And he went to them, and this is what he said. He said, it doesn't matter what you think of me and what I think of you right now. We have an enemy, and we will lose our freedoms. These very factories you love, if we don't build a war machine, you're going to lose these factories. And what I want to say to people right now, whether it's Anglican, Baptist, Christian, whether you once voted Labor, voted Liberal, this is about our country's freedoms. And we need to build, and I use this word very carefully, a war machine. And I'm not talking about wars and guns. People, you all know what I'm talking about. We need a war machine. I think it was DuPont did the grenades, Boeing did the planes. He went to them and they built an American war machine that defeated the tyranny of these two nations. And what I'm asking you guys to do is to get out there right now and solidify, you know what? I'm very pro-Clive. I'm very pro-Pauline. And I never used to be. I was a staunch Liberal voter. I grew up in Bankstown, went to Bankstown de La Salle, same school that Paul Keating went to. As a matter of fact, my brother went to school with Paul Keating. We'll leave that one alone. But here's what I want to encourage you to do. Write to them and say to them, we're not voting for you anymore. We've had enough. And take your time and let's work on what we've got in common. And even to my Christian friends of different denominations and backgrounds, and we've got to work together for our freedoms. Stop squabbling about things that don't matter right now, and let's focus on what's important. We're gonna be done in about 10 minutes, but quickly, James, before I ask your opinion on two things. Where can we find you, James? Where can we find you? How do all these wonderful hundreds of thousands of people follow you? Tell us.
So James McPherson on Twitter, and James Macpherson on Instagram. So it couldn't be any easier, Pat. Macpherson. Same spelling as L, but no relation.
And you've got a book coming out. I'm not trying to pressure you, but I hear you got a book coming out. Little birdie told me.
I do. It will be out before Christmas, and it's called Notes from Woketopia. And it's a selection of articles from The Spectator talking about faith, culture, and politics as they are being portrayed by woke people, particularly in Australia. And Pat, my contention is that the battle now is not between the left and the right. It's not between this religion or that religion. Literally, we're in a battle between sane and the insane, the normal and the abnormal. And to be honest with you, I think one of the best ways to dismantle bad ideas is to laugh at them and to mock them. Psalm chapter 2 says that God sits in the heavens and he laughs at the nations that rage against him. It's a little bit like the emperor who was wearing no clothes, and everyone took him seriously until a little child started laughing. And once they were laughing at him, the gig was up. That's why the Ayatollah Khomeini famously said there are no jokes in Islam. Well, they can't afford any. But it's just the progressive left don't like jokes either, because the moment you start laughing at the fact that there are now 72 genders, if you laugh at that, then it's over. If you laugh at a biological man being named the New Zealand Sportswoman of the Year, then it's over. And so it's called Notes from Woketopia, and it really does send up and mock just the insane ideas that we are expected to not only agree to, but we're expected to repeat these things as if we really believe them. It's madness. So might as well laugh, enjoy the apocalypse together.
I want everyone to hang on for another 10 minutes or so, because I want to talk about Victoria and I call him Damn Andrews. But Ellie, where do we find you? Where can we find these articles? Where can we follow you? Where can we, extrapolate out of your mind all those wonderful thoughts and that we can really build our nation? Where do we find you?
Okay, well, my primary haunt is Twitter, so you can find me there as Ellie Melly. And from that, I've got a link to my blog, and on my blog, I post all of my articles, no matter where they go. They're all down the sidebar, so you can follow them there. And obviously, I'm an independent writer who survives on the good graces of my readers, so there's a link to my Ko-fi there if you guys are interested in shouting me a coffee. But basically, before I go there, what I wanted to say is just to reassure everybody that if communism worked, then China wouldn't need a social credit system. So as soon as you start seeing politicians use force and coercion, you know that the game is up, because they haven't been able to win the argument on merit. And once that happens, you're at the beginning of the end, and it will not last.
Speaking of communism, dictator Dan Andrews holds the gold standard for the most lockdown state or most lockdown place in the world. I'm going to go out there. How is this crooked guy, in my opinion, most corrupt party in Australian politics, most corrupt police force, a patsy to the unions, how is this guy lasted? And now IBAC's after him, and for what I believe with good reason. How's he getting away with this? Is it Stockholm syndrome, or is it has he got leverage on his in-room party mates there who are as corrupt as an underworld card playing game?
Is this for me?
Oh, it's for both of you.
Okay. Look, Daniel Andrews is even weaker than Scott Morrison, if that's possible. What he did is handed over control of his state to health bureaucrats, who are the most tyrannical people in the whole world. Everyone knows you don't give doctors any more power than their little narrow surgeries, because they're dangerous. You've got to keep them contained within normal laws. And worse, that would not have mattered if there was a functioning opposition party down in Victoria. But like Western Australia, the Liberals seem to be completely absent. Now, I had a really good friend who worked for Matthew Guy back when he was, before his current stint, when he was also leader of the opposition. Same thing, different era. And they just have no soul. They don't understand what it means to be an actual conservative and fight for the rights of individuals in society. That is what it means to be a conservative. Instead, what they do is they're so worried and frightened of the press gallery that they follow underneath Labor's wing, hoping they won't attract any criticism. But of course, if they're not being criticised, then they're not doing any good against Daniel Andrews. So they're almost like a tame pet that Andrews has on a leash, which means that he can do whatever he wants without scrutiny, and the people have nobody else to vote for to change it.
These guys are so weak. I mean, look, the Liberal Party opposition in Victoria is about as weak as that recalcitrant fool who runs the Labor Party in New South Wales and has the audacity to call a great girl like Tanya Davies dangerous. Mate, let me tell you, she's doing your job. But before I get James to come and make a comment, let me just go through a few things about Dan Andrews. IBAC corruption probe. IBAC is investigating his widespread corruption. One guy in his government paid his tax-paid driver to drive his dog around because these people can't walk their own dogs easily. Brand stashing through Mr. LD, $380,000 spent on the red shirt sports to pay for political campaigns. Jenny Mikolos basically threw him under a bus, and how the heck he got away with it, I'm not too sure. Now the firefighters union. This guy is worse. They used to call John Gotti the Teflon Don. This guy's a Teflon premier. But I pray to God that God laughs and the emperor's clothes get exposed. James, over to you.
The problem with Victoria is not just Dan Andrews. While ever there's an ineffective opposition, Dan Andrews will get away with whatever Dan Andrews does. You know, the Melbourne Age today ran a story saying that the biggest threat to the Liberal Party's chances of election is the church. Christians the party needs to stop the influence of the church. When I read that, I thought they might as well just hand Dan Andrews next election now. When the Liberal Party moves away from conservatism, moves away from family values, moves away from traditional mores, and starts fearing that the church might be an electoral problem for them, then the Liberal Party are going to lose their base and Dan Andrews will continue to win elections. So as much as we want to go on about how bad Daniel Andrews is, the Liberal Party in Victoria is a shocker. And I personally think Dan Andrews can keep winning elections.
Well, I was going to point out that the biggest problem is that humans follow strength, even if the strength isn't good. So while ever Dan Andrews presents a stronger front than the Conservatives down in Victoria, he will continue to win, no matter how bad he is.
Stockholm Syndrome, methinks. Stockholm Syndrome. Before I get some final comments, everyone out there, look, my team and I, we know that during lockdown, you know, a lot of you are hurting and a lot of you are struggling and our minds can be bombarded. And I want to say thank you for giving us this hour on a Friday afternoon, and thanks to Ellie and James. And they've got family, as do I. But I and my team prepared a very special gift for you all, every one of you. If you go to, I'll tell you what you get included in this gift. Number one, you get my best-selling book, Attitudes and Altitudes, which was apparently a classic in leadership. You get that. You also get my latest book, Unbreakable, which is really about what's happening in this COVID world and how you can help your business. But also, in a couple of weeks, I've invited the legendary Kim Kiyosaki, wife of Robert Kiyosaki. So girls, this is going to be really good for you, also for men. And she's going to speak to you guys in an exclusive interview on how to really rebuild your life, your business, your finances in this current economic climate. Kim is a wonderful lady, a brilliant philanthropist, an intelligent mind. I tell you what would be awesome if I could get Ellie and Kim both on that program. That'd rock the world. So if you go to right now, www.masidi.com/push, on our Facebook. My team's putting in there in the chat, and it's free, okay? It's free. People say, nothing in the world is free. Well, you know who says that? Stingy people who don't give. And one of the good things that the good book says is, given it shall be given unto you, pressed down, shaken together. And these are free gifts. You opt in, you get the free seminar, the books. And and by the way, there's also a message of my great mentor, Mr. Peter J. Daniels, a man that changed my life, absolutely changed my life as a broke youth leader. So they're our gifts to you. All right, Ellie, James, any parting words?
I should probably definitely be part of that seminar, because my whole life collapsed with COVID, and I'm just starting to rebuild little bricks back up again.
Get on that. Get the free stuff and join us. And I might even bring you in. I'm not going to bring James in, because unless he has a shave, he just, he's a good-looking fella, and he's got this Gucci stubble thing. So, Ellie, we'd love to have you. Parting words, Ellie. Any final words from you?
This is a really strange thing for a non-religious person to say, but don't lose faith. Humanity has a way of fighting for its freedom one way or another. And I think we'll find that the Western world isn't ready for tyrannical dystopia yet. Ellie,
let me tell you something. You say you're not a person of faith, but I want to tell you something. You have given people a lot of faith today. And as a dad,
I have faith in humanity. I have faith in humanity that they will come through.
You do. And the human spirit is amazing. And, but thank you. And I mean that. So from all of us, can we give her a big thank you? James McPherson, final words.
Well, first I've got to say, Ellie is my favourite not yet Christian. And for her to come on the Pat Mesiti show.
Mine too.
Just answered a prayer. Ellie, I'm so excited. This is wonderful. Parting words, Pat. Freedom is not the normal condition of humanity. When we look at how Australia has been up until fairly recently, that's not normal. People have not normally been free. They've normally been oppressed or opposed. And so freedom is important not just to have, but to keep. And if we lose our freedom, it's on us. And so I think every person has a responsibility, not just to tweet, not just to tune into things like this, but as Ellie explained earlier, you've got to contact your local member, whether by phone or by email, and you've got to put your case to them and express your dissatisfaction. There's no point just sitting back whinging. We need to pray, and we need to advocate to the people that matter, and those are our local members. And I think it's really important at a time like this that we do those things. We can't just be people who whinge and whine.
Correct.
We need to be people participate, and I think that's really important.
No, whinge and whine a lot as well. Whinge and whine as well, because they're extraordinarily vain creatures. When you leave 2,000 comments on a Facebook post or a Twitter thing, believe it or not, that actually changes the behavior of your politician.
Absolutely.
So sorry, James, but take to your keyboard and annoy the living heck out of them.
Oh, Ellie, you are my favorite non-Christian yet person too. Now listen, everybody, listen very carefully. October 22nd, 10 a.m. till about 1:30 is Prayer and Pushback 2. Ellie's coming on. Hopefully we can get James or a few others. But David Harris Jr. from the United States is coming on. I'm working on Candace Owens. How good is that? And from the United States. I also have Craig Kelly's confirmed. Real Rushkan's confirmed. Maria Malik. Joel Jamal is confirmed. Bishop Marmari has confirmed. I'm trying to not leave as many people out. I've got one of the major leaders from New Zealand. So all my Maori and Polynesian people, you're going to love this guy. Great leader. So we've got Craig Kelly, where Pauline's getting back to us. Senator Malcolm Roberts, George Christensen, a great guy out there waving the flag. I'm trying to find someone in Victoria, but we may just leave that alone unless Ellie or James, you can help me in that one. And guys, it's going to be 22nd of October, 10 a.m. I've got to work out with a Sydney or Melbourne time with the guys from the production company. But also go there right now and get the free gift. As we give out, I know it'll come back to you. And www.mesiti.com/push. If we could get that on the screen, the guys there it is, screenshot it. and get your gifts. Ellie, James, thank you so much. Love you and appreciate you both. This has been a dream come true.
Thank you for having me on.
Bless you guys. Thank you.